Welcome to Between Two Chairs, Demystifying Commercial Real Estate, the podcast that brings you the latest insights and trends on the South Florida commercial real estate market, with your hosts, Fernando Arencibia Jr. and Jennifer Woolman. In each episode, we dive into the world of commercial real estate and break down complex concepts to make them accessible for everyone. Whether you're a real estate professional, a curious investor, or just interested in the South Florida market in general, Between Two Chairs is the podcast for you. So pull up a chair and join us.
Is that for...
So I am sitting between two ferns.
You can't sit.
I'm sitting between two. Since I heard Jess call you Fern a while back, I've been like, oh my God, I've got to get a fern. I've got to get a fern.
I never even thought about that.
Yes. And then awesome. When Bill Lyons made that comment, I'm like, or William. Yeah. Does he go by William or Bill? But that's what I thought. Yeah. When I saw Bill's comment, I was like, oh my gosh, I better hurry up and do this because if I don't do it, but I only found this little fern. So I've got a little fern and a big fern.
Well, this whole name is an homage to Between Two Ferns. So I guess, now we're getting into, very literal territory.
Well, that's the last time you'll see this fern because I do not have a green thumb and they're hard to keep alive. So it will probably die if I don't give it to Carlos to nurture.
You let me know. We have Rachel out here. She also has a green thumb. Thank God.
In the conference room. So welcome back to Between Two Chairs, and continuing with our month of gratitude for November, I want to give a shout out and a huge thank you to Heidi Webb, the Port Director and CEO of PortMiami, and to Frederick Wong, who is the Deputy Port Director for PortMiami. And so if you haven't guessed, this episode is going to be about PortMiami and the impact that PortMiami has not only on the economics of our area, but also on the commercial real estate in South Miami. Well, I should say the South Florida, right? Metro Miami is lucky enough to be blessed with 3 ports. There's one in Palm Beach, then there's Port Everglades and Port Miami. But so huge economic impact for the whole region. But we're going to focus on Port Miami because Fernando and I were lucky enough to have a beautiful, amazing, eye-opening, fun behind-the-scenes tour of Port Miami. Yeah. And it was just eye-opening.
It was just an incredible experience just to see the inner workings of the port that is both one of the busiest cargo ports and, as they call it, the cruise capital of the world. So it both has to handle a huge amount of passengers per year and also, the 10th busiest port in Florida, and to be so, to have to handle so much cargo as well. And the dichotomy, the intricacies of dealing with both of those things, which are very different and are treated very different. The reason why we want to do a show about the port is because, when you're looking at commercial real estate and the forces that affect it are both macroeconomic and microeconomic forces. And it's very important for you to understand that whether you're dealing with residential or commercial real estate, right, there are certain elements that are true to both. And one of those is location, right? And location being a very important component of where you buy, sell, lease, real estate. I remember a few years back, we had the opportunity to make a presentation. We, meaning the Miami Association of Realtors, had an opportunity to present on all the virtues of Miami. And we were trying to break down, how do you break down Miami in a 5-minute presentation so that it gives people a glimpse of why it is a great place to live, work, play. And so I wanted, if you don't mind, just kind of tell people what were the major themes of that presentation. One of them was quality of life. The other one was talent, right? And, we're talking about, obviously we have some very entertaining and talented people. We're talking about the talent that builds companies, right? We're talking about, this multicultural talent that exists in Miami that is very unique to who we are. We're talking about the entrepreneurial spirit of our people and things of that nature. Then the fact that we are a global business center, and we talked about how outside of Manhattan, it is the second finance capital of the United States. Then we get into infrastructure, and that's when we talk about our ports, we talk about transportation, we talk about our airports. And so this is the part that a lot of people sometimes don't equate with when they're selling Miami, but it is an important component. And as many things Miami, we do that well also, which is great.
And I think it's interesting because, our port's beautiful too, right? It's an island in the middle of our government cut, so it's surrounded by blue water. We drive by it all the time. And some of the architecture on the side that we see the most, which is which are the cruise ship terminals, are gorgeous. Right. The cruise ships have done a very nice job at putting beautiful buildings on the port. So it was interesting to get the behind the scenes look because, you see on one side of the port, you see all of the cruise ship and the passenger terminals and the beautiful ships as that they line up and get ready to leave. And then in the background, you see the huge cranes, right, that are used for the cargo. So when we went behind the scenes, first of all, the port is 520 acres and it's divided into the two halves, right? So on the north side, you have the port, the cruise ships, and on the south side, you have the cargo. And in between, there's a road that people drive on. And it all functioned so seamlessly. Everything, granted, we weren't there on the day when passenger ships were loading, but it was incredible how organized, which obviously it has to be, the port was. But, it contributes, it generates $43 billion and supports 334,500 jobs. So between, the overall port. So I thought that something that's small if you think about it. 540 acres to be generating that amount of income to the area was huge, that economic impact.
The first thing is that it's a very beautiful port to drive into.
Correct.
Right? Because you're surrounded by water. Even on an ugly day, there's something about being surrounded by water. And I don't mean an ugly day, but like an overcast, like it's rainy, it's still beautiful, but it's a beautiful, port to drive into. But I also found that the confines, one of the things that really you get a kick out of it, if you ever do a tour of the port, is when you look at the map and how the map has changed over the years. There are limitations as to where you can grow, but I find that also forces you to be much more efficient. And it looks to me like, to your point about the organization of it, it looks to me like that efficiency is a priority from top to bottom. When we did that tour and we got on the van and we started driving around, it's like the tale of two ports, right? It's two different sides to it and two very different experiences.
And two completely different operations and what they have to look out for and what they have to pay attention to and everything else. So I also loved their customer service, and their customer service wasn't for the port, right, for the passengers, right? The customer service was for their cargo ship operators and their cruise ship operators, and how they consider them all partners, and how they worked with all of them during the pandemic, and what they did for the operators during the pandemic when, when occupancy plummeted. So let's start with a little bit of the cruise statistics.
Sure.
So prior to the pandemic, they were on track to exceed 7 million cruise passengers. They generated, this was in 2019, 7,040,000 jobs a year for all of the support services. So that includes air transportation, ground transportation, F&B, the overnight stays for cruise passengers, et cetera. And then the pandemic brought everything to a halt. And in 2021, there were only 252,000 passengers. So the port really did, they went through in great detail, what they did, how they helped the cruise lines to be partners in this pandemic, right? And that really helped them gain it back when the passengers came back, which last year, the cruise ship passengers climbed to a little over 4 million, and they're estimating that they're going to do 6.7 million this year, which is amazing, almost back on track. And they might even surpass it because they had 2 days this year that they had the most passenger traffic in one day. The last one was in April, and they had over 67,000, almost 68,000 passengers go through, which I can't imagine, having seen the long, skinny line where the port is, right? Because our port is very long. It's not a square or a rectangle. It's like this really long, skinny island. And to think of 67,000 passengers going through on that side is crazy. But to your point, they were very, very efficient and super well organized.
And the fact that, they got to deal with security. So think about, making sure that everybody is safe, all 67,000 plus, everybody gets screened, everybody goes through their, immigration process, whatever it is that they need, all the paperwork. Whenever I go to these things, I always gravitate to, okay, how does a person work here? How do they, and how is this business carried out? I'm always looking for lessons. And you hit the number one important lesson that I gathered from our conversations with them is the fact that they looked at these vendors or these contracts not necessarily as what that is, on paper, but more into these are our partners, right? And these are our partners for a very, very long time. And so we want to take good care of them. They had an opportunity to, charge some fees that other ports were charging and, try to kind of make up for the losses. And, they decided, what, we're not going to do that. We're not going to nickel and dime our partners, right? They're going through a rough time. We're going through a rough time. We're going to figure this out together, and we're going to be the better of it, on the other end. And I think that there's something really important about this collaborative approach to when you're working with people. It's this idea that, it's not, it changes the paradigm of every conversation that you have if your mindset is of a partnership.
Right. And, we always say that relationships are what run commercial real estate, right? And with the Port of Miami, it was the same thing, right? They focused on the relationships. And what I found amazing is they brought in the county. They brought in Miami-Dade County because obviously it is, part of the county. And they told the county what was happening, why they didn't want to charge, why they wanted to give concessions, why they wanted to help. And the county agreed. So talk about, it wouldn't have worked for the port if the port had wanted to be partners and the county was pushing back. So the fact that that was so cohesive, it was such a proud Miami moment for me that was really working.
And how interesting it was, because of course, not everybody in the room was a commercial, real estate broker. And so found it interesting that those of us that were in commercial, we gravitated to how these contracts are created, and it was great to see that the person that is in charge of that was in commercial real estate, because there's so much of it is very much tied in to the way that we negotiate leases with, of course, the wrinkles that are specific to the industry. I thought that was awesome. I could have sat and spoken to them about that for the rest of the day.
I know, really taking it apart. So in our previous episode, Robin Webb talked about the hotel industry in South Florida, and we're going to get into F&B in another episode, so we're not going to talk about that now. So let's jump to cargo, which, cargo, in spite of the pandemic, their numbers increased.
By the way, before we get to cargo, can we speak about, we got to see a little bit of the behind the scene as we were walking through the Virgin Cruise Lines.
They're building.
This is where all the passengers go. They have what, the Scarlet,
terminal.
the terminal. There you go. Thank you, Jessica. The Scarlet Princess or something like that. that?
I don't know. I just remember everything was red, so we were right at home. Commercial red.
Commercial red. Man, what a beautiful experience.
Beautiful.
What a beautiful experience. And even the way that they designed the canopy as you're walking out. And I found that interesting, that whole conversation of why don't they have more amenities in the terminal?
Right.
But the cruise ship just wants they want to get people into the cruise ship. They want you to enjoy the amenities in the cruise ship.
Right. They don't want you to stand around waiting in a terminal, no matter how gorgeous it is.
Yeah, they're looking for efficiency. They want to get you in there, drop off your bags, get a drink, relax while we get everybody else in here, and start your shift of vacation. But anyway, I just wanted to say kudos to Virgin that the terminal there is beautiful. It's it was very impressive.
So, in spite of the pandemic, PortMiami's cargo numbers increased 17.6% to 1.25 20-foot equivalent units, known as a TEU, which is how cargo is measured, which is just basically the size of a 20-foot container, right?
Right, correct.
You had mentioned earlier about the port and the fact that it's on an island and their efficiencies, but one of the things that they're actually looking at is, in order to continue and grow, they're looking at an inland port and an inland, like, off-dock logistics yard, because what we saw during the offloading of the vessels was that, obviously everything comes in pretty much on containers, and containers themselves can create kind of a logistics nightmare, because you have to, you offload them to the ship, you have to wait for the trucks to come and pick them up and take them wherever, but then once they're offloaded, oftentimes they come back to the port and they sit empty until they get shipped back, either full of exports or whatever. So whenever I think of logistics, obviously you think of warehouses and the industrial sector. But in this case, they're also looking for storage yards, right? Yards to store the containers, yards to store the cargo while it's in transit before it gets shipped off to wherever it's going, or before it goes back to the port. And I thought it was interesting because it really coincided with what Sebastian Juncadella with Fairchild's Partners had mentioned at the Miami Commercial Conference, which was that in addition to the huge demand for industrial space, there was a huge demand, especially this year, for industrial outdoor storage space, and that investment groups have realized that with land achieving triple net figures because of the construction side and the demand for construction, that they could actually make pretty good money with land and building out these storage facilities that don't necessarily involve warehouses.
No, I think that is an interesting component. And so, I think that a lot of industrial investors are always looking at these data points from the port, from the airport, to really understand demand and where that demand is going to be. The other thing that happens is, those containers are not going to make their way out of the port, by themselves, and we're always looking at those, the last 100 feet, and when it comes to deliveries and transportation and all those stuff, but those trucks need a place to be, right? They got to move quickly, they got to move through our major thoroughfares, and so it's important to recognize that more and more in the county there's less space for that to be stored, right? Correct. And so, and either it's because of zoning changes or upzoning of areas, or the fact that people just don't want to deal with the potential environmental issues on their land. But the reality is that there is a need for that, and we need to find a solution to it. So that's why I think that these outdoor spaces, we're going to see more and more of those, come about.
Correct. And one of the things in the study that the port had put out that I found was interesting was that they had already highlighted certain areas, right? Because they knew they didn't want to be near a ton of residential. They knew that they wanted to be in an area that either the county or the state already owned the land. They wanted to be somewhere where the turnaround was going to be quick in terms of truck traffic, so being close to all the major highways, and preferably they wanted to be close to rail. Obviously a very logical way to approach it, but that severely limits where in the county, it pretty much keeps them contained to the airport, Port West, the Medley, the Hialeah Gardens, and it gets harder and harder because those areas, Doral and Hialeah Gardens are going extremely residential, right? So that becomes a challenge as well for the logistics, not just for the owners, but for something as massive as a port. I thought that was really interesting.
Absolutely. And I think that these are the kinds of numbers that you kind of want to keep track of just to see where is it trending. Does it continue to trend up? Is that demand going to always be here? We as a market, compared to, let's say, places like Chicago, we don't have a lot of industrial inventory. That's why you see a lot of industrial development happening here, And I think that, to your point about these outdoor spaces, that there's a way to monetize them without having to build up, right away, especially with the cost of construction and all the other considerations. So you can monetize it, but you can also be a part of this important aspect of the inner workings of our local economy by providing for efficiencies in the way that logistics are done from top to bottom, where they're stored, where things are moving from side to side, how they can be more beneficial throughout the city. I find that in our city, a lot of the zoning and a lot of just market forces have moved us away from storing these trucks that are moving these containers all throughout the city, and also mechanic shops. I just think
right.
like they're kind of under attack. Like nobody wants them, but everybody needs them, right? And so it's an important part of the conversation. And so I really enjoy that when we get to do things like this, that you get a little bit of a behind the scenes of one thing is affecting the other. One of the things that you mentioned, which I think it's an important thing for us to discuss, is this is a port that creates over 354,000 jobs. And we asked the question about what is it that they're seeing as because a lot of people are talking about employment retention, right? Because we've gone through this period of this quiet quitting and, people going to the gig economy and all these changes and the dynamics of that. And so I always like to ask that question because I'm curious, how well do they do for employee retention, all that stuff. And of course, the biggest issue they find is an issue of lack of affordable housing. And that was one of the main points of discussion there.
I think the great thing about these kind of tours, and what I think is really important, is that as commercial brokers, we get really focused on our market, we get focused on our asset class. And so sometimes we get so focused on the details that we don't see the bigger picture. So I loved this tour because it made us take a step back and look at everything holistically. So if the port is such a huge economic driver and it's on limited space, how does it continue to be successful? How does it continue to grow its capacity? How does it continue beyond efficiencies, which they're always looking at? How does that continue if at the same time Miami-Dade is becoming more and more expensive and more luxury residential? So in addition to the workers, I think of the entire crew that are on these ships, right? Whether they're on the cruise ships or on the cargo ships. Yeah. I remember years ago, there was a really good little restaurant in downtown Miami, and I'm blanking on the name right now. But I remember it was a tiny little hole in the wall. And one day I was there and there were a ton of people in there and I couldn't figure out what it was. And it turns out that it was cooking and home cooking for a lot of these crew members. And so it was packed, and as we become more expensive and more luxurious, not only in terms of housing, but how do we support the needs of that crew when they get offshore and they don't have transportation and they can't be commuting really, long distances because they don't have a ton of leave time. And so even though I love the fact that we're becoming, a much more, 24-hour city and luxury city and everything else because of all of the great economic benefits and fun activities that come from that, I think we always need to remember the people who helped build it and the economic engines that helped build it, and make sure that those economic engines are still supported and still have a place in there, and that
Right.
includes affordable housing, affordable spaces for restaurants that service the crew, and whatever else they might need.
I think that, the reality is that, as a business enterprise or as any kind of enterprise, I think that especially if you're relocating a company to a location, that those things are not only going to be part of the conversation. I think more and more endeavors such as this, whether it's private or public, they're going to have to say, is there a solution that we can create for our own employees?
Right.
Forget about the macro forces and whether we're going to have affordability.
Right.
What can we do to actually generate something that is affordable for our employees that can actually, make a difference? I've told the story before about, selling this 18-unit multifamily, building to a hotelier because, he was looking for housing for his employees. He was tired of losing great employees just because they didn't have an affordable place to be. And he says, and I could rent it at market rents as long as they are aware that we're not going to increase rents. And I think that was part of the conversation. Is there a place in the port where you could build housing for the people that you employ? Is there a place close to the port where that can happen as well? Because, the further you go out, it creates other, unintended consequences, right? But the port is a huge economic engine of South Florida.
Right.
And everyone who works in downtown or works in the port, anybody who works surrounding it feels the economic effect and that impact immediately. I remember working at a clothing store back in the 90s. It was called Oak Tree Menswear. They're no longer around. Don't look them up. They were actually in one of the Nathan Rock's buildings in Flagler, right on Flagler, in downtown Miami. I'm sure Moshe has some stuff around there now. But I remember Thursdays sometimes were kind of slow, and then there were weeks where they were super busy, and all we had was basically, port, all the people that worked in the cruise ships that were buying clothes or, they were shopping around. They had 3-4 hours, and they would go to downtown Miami, and it was always a great experience to have conversations with them because, I remember this one gentleman. He was originally from Santo Domingo in Dominican Republic. Basically, he considered himself a nomad. He goes like, look, I do this job. I'm here for like 8 months. I don't spend any money. I send everything back home. I come and buy clothes, but I buy for my nephews and my nieces, and I buy for my family and everybody else. But he just says, I've seen parts of the world, and I get to provide, and but it's a very different experience. But ultimately, those people invest a lot of money locally in our local shops, and because he wanted to come and buy something local, and have that experience.
And then you put in the tourists who are coming and that have a layover either before or after. And one of the things that just popped to mind, because you just talked about the effect of retail, and we know, like Bayside is all catered to the tourists really, that come in and just have a really short layover before they hop on the ship. But one of the things that they mentioned during the tour was Frederick said that they've noticed that during the pandemic, and actually since the pandemic, because of all of the issues with airlines, that people are driving from really, really far away. So that makes me think, okay, so we also need, similar to the airport has the long-term off-site parking, there might also need to be something for parking for passengers, because I've had 2 people recently that I know take cruise ships, and even though their flights were planned 3 days ahead, one of them missed her cruise to Alaska because of flight delays, and no matter what she tried, she just couldn't get there. And there they wouldn't let her board the ship after it left the port because of, I can't remember. Because of all the legal stuff. And then the other one made it to Europe to catch to catch her cruise super late. Like she almost missed her cruise as well. So I thought that was interesting, because that opens up a whole nother real estate potential market, right? Like people who want to drive, where do they leave their cars?
Right.
So anyway, lots of real estate related to port traffic.
I also will say, for those of you who are in commercial real estate or, or getting into commercial real estate, if you have an opportunity to speak to anyone who is in the transportation industry, anyone that has to process cargo, that has to do with bonded or not bonded warehousing, that has to process the documentation that, when containers get stuck because they're not processed right or whatever it is, there's a lot of intricacies to it, and there are often solutions that are needed, to address those things. I think it's an important component of, if you're going to work in the industrial sector, to really understand how those things, how things move. Plus, you get an insight as to, how things actually make it to your table and your home, throughout the world. So, it's always incredibly interesting.
Right. And most of the, just because transportation is so huge in Miami-Dade, well, in South Florida and overall, but most of the commercial conferences in the area usually have a panel. The Miami Commercial Conference had one with the Miami-Dade Aviation Department Director and Derek Cook and Brightline Holdings, Michael, I think his name is Lefevre. So those are always great overviews too, and you get a little bit, you're not just transportation focused, but you get a really good overview of how it's all interconnected and the importance of thinking about that wherever you locate your commercial real estate.
I will say also that just like the airport, that the port is, if you go to their website, they have a lot of great data. They update that, kind of regularly, and you get to have a lot of insights into these stats by going to some of their sites. To go back to the map that we saw, this is a place that is going to look very differently 10, 15, 20 years from now. I think that's what happens. Somebody told me one time there are certain places in every city and in every place that are always growing, and that is hospitals, universities, ports, and airports, So I think that is very true. And so there's always going to be growth. There's always going to be development. And that's part for the course. So, partner, are you ready for the stat of the day, or did you have other insights into the port that you wanted to share?
We're good. You want to start?
Well, look, I wanted to just share this because I thought this was very impactful. You mentioned Sebastian Juncadella, and at the Miami Commercial Conference, he mentioned this stat, which I thought was really interesting, because he was asking people for questions and everybody was giving them the wrong answer. And that is that aside from the Port of Miami, we also have another port north of us, which is known as Port Everglades in Fort Lauderdale. And he asked this question: what percentage of the cargo that goes into Port Everglades, which is, north of Miami, actually makes it to Miami? And to the surprise of it all, 69% of all inbound cargo is distributed and consumed in Miami-Dade County, and it lands in Broward County at Port Everglades.
Oh, yeah.
So I thought that was a really interesting. Yeah.
Yeah.
So again, imagine that, you would think, well, almost 70%, right? Would it be cheaper if it landed in Miami?
Right.
But, the transportation side. But that, I found that super interesting. How that,
When I think of cargo ports, I usually think, they're unloading stuff and putting it on trucks, and then the majority of it, some stays local, and then the majority goes off. But here,
same here.
It's not the case. Most of it stays here, which is fascinating.
Which is fascinating for sure.
So I was so proud. I am so proud of Port Miami. And then I thought, let me see what the biggest port is with acreage and everything. And so Port of Los Angeles is the single biggest port in the U.S. Last year, it moved more than 9.3 million TEUs.
Oh my God.
And it stretches 43 miles along the coast, and it takes up 8,000 acres of land.
So that's like 8 times what Port of Miami does That's unbelievable.
That's an amazing number. And
But it makes sense, right? Because
Right.
it would mostly would be Asia, right? Because one of the things about Port Miami that we didn't discuss is that it is the closest U.S. East Coast deep water container port to Panama Canal.
Right.
So it can take these super containers ships. So, but you would think that makes sense, right? Because they're getting a lot of that cargo is coming from Asia.
correct. And we're seeing a move. Casey Conway always points out that there's a shift because
Right.
of when they expanded the Panama Canal
Right.
and the deep water dredge along the East Coast ports. Now, so before, I can't remember what year it was, but I want to say in the early 1990s, the majority of the cargo to the U.S. actually came to the East Coast.
Right.
And then it shifted to the West Coast, and now there seems to be a move coming back. Mm-hmm. And that is some of the stuff that Port Miami already got ready for the Panamax ships, but now
Right.
they're getting ready to get even bigger containers coming over. So
Yeah, I think Casey
that's part of the
Conway was
reason.
mentioning this triangle shift in really the hub of transportation. I think he was talking about the port of Houston,
Correct.
and then somewhere in the Northeast, and then South
then
Florida.
South
So
Florida, right.
it was that. Yeah, that's it's infinitely interesting to commercial real estate nerds like us. So I hope you all have found that interesting. Thank you again for joining us on another episode of Between Two Chairs. We really, really appreciate you listening and giving us your feedback. I'm Fernando Arencibia, and as always, I'm here with the amazing Jennifer Woolman. Jennifer, say goodbye.
Goodbye. Say goodbye to my fern.
Goodbye.